Listen, you need to grasp how serious this situation really is, because right now we're seeing a total transformation in how trade works across North America. Canada has firmly committed to strengthening its agreement with China. And this isn't some small tweak or empty symbol. It's Prime Minister Mark Carney's administration staring straight at Donald Trump's warnings, including his talk of 100% tariffs, and replying, "We're moving ahead regardless." Let me break down precisely what occurred, since the specifics carry huge weight. They carry enormous weight. Back in January, Mark Carney traveled to Beijing, not to Washington, but to Beijing. During that visit, Canada and China wrapped up a broad trade pact that completely reshapes the economic picture on this continent. China committed to cutting tariffs on Canadian farm goods. We're referring to canola, lobsters, peas, genuine items from actual Canadian farmers and fishers who have faced tough times for years. But the element driving Washington into a frenzy is this: Canada reduced its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% all the way to 6%, just 6%. And they're permitting as many as 49,000 Chinese-built EVs to enter Canada each year. Trump had cautioned Canada explicitly. He stood up in January and promised a 100% tariff on every Canadian product if this arrangement proceeded. 100%. He even claimed Canada would turn into a staging point for Chinese goods targeting the U.S. market. The standard scare tactics, the typical intimidation methods that have shaped U.S.-Canada ties for way too long. And guess what? Carney went through with it anyway. Let me make clear why this goes far beyond mere figures in a report. For generations, Canada has been financially bound to the United States in a manner that's frankly been stifling. About 75% of Canadian exports have historically headed south across the border. That level of reliance hands the United States massive influence. And various U.S. governments have applied that influence at times quietly, at times quite openly. Trump's tariff warnings weren't original. They were simply more aggressive, more blunt forms of the pressure that's existed all along. Yet what Carney is accomplishing, what this China pact symbolizes, is Canada finally declaring that it's had enough. His government has targeted a sharp rise in exports outside the U.S. by 2035. They're not aiming for slight changes. They're pursuing a complete overhaul of Canada's economic ties so that no one nation, particularly not the United States, can endanger Canada's economy. And the timing couldn't be better, because as we speak, U.S. pressure strategies are failing dramatically. Trump believed his 100% tariff warning would force Canada to retreat. Instead, it sped up Canada's shift toward China. It showed Canadians precisely why diversification is essential. It built a stronger argument for Carney's plan than any campaign speech possibly could. Let's consider who gains from this arrangement immediately, right now. Because this isn't some distant theory. Actual Canadian sectors are experiencing genuine advantages already. The beef sector saw China reopen its market to Canadian beef following a ban dating back to 2021. Do you realize what that delivers for Canadian ranchers and processors? We're discussing entry to one of the planet's biggest beef markets, employment, income, stability for areas that have been hurting. Canadian growers of canola, those harvesting lobsters, those producing peas, they now face lower tariffs accessing the Chinese market. These aren't token moves. These are solid economic gains that directly improve living standards for Canadian agricultural employees. Then there's the electric vehicle aspect. By slashing tariffs on Chinese EVs, Canada is placing itself ahead in the shift to electric transportation. These are reasonably priced vehicles that Canadians genuinely desire and require. The U.S. auto sector has lagged in adapting, charges high prices, and honestly doesn't match consumer demands. Chinese producers have dominated the EV space globally, and Canada chose to grant its people access to reliable, budget-friendly electric vehicles rather than shield a struggling American auto industry. Now let's examine the response in Washington, because it reveals everything about how severely this has rebounded against American goals. Trump and his supporters are in full panic mode. They're rushing to respond because they're grasping, likely too late, that their intimidation approaches no longer succeed. Canada called their bluff. Consider it briefly from the U.S. viewpoint. They've counted on economic control over Canada for so long that they overlooked Canada's choices. They forgot Canada is a G7 country with vast natural resources, a skilled population, and the capacity to build links with other large economies. When Trump issued that 100% tariff warning, he assumed he held the upper hand. What he truly achieved was showing every Canadian the necessity of lowering reliance on the United States. He strengthened Carney's position. He provided the Prime Minister with ideal political cover for turning toward China. And now American companies are the ones dealing with fallout. Because if the U.S. actually enacts those tariff promises, American buyers lose Canadian lumber, Canadian energy, Canadian farm goods, Canadian auto components. Supply chains integrated for decades would face disruption, prices would surge, and all to penalize Canada for pursuing its own trade approach. Make no mistake about another key point here. China is gaining hugely from this exchange. Beijing never resorted to threats. They never bullied Canada. They simply presented a balanced offer, treating Canada as an equal instead of a lesser partner. By doing that, they've created division between the United States and one of its oldest allies. When China stated this trade pact doesn't aim at any third country, it was polite wording. But it's obvious to all what's occurring. China gains greater entry to the Canadian market, establishes a presence in North America for its EVs, and shows other nations an option to U.S. economic control. This is brilliant strategy from Beijing. They avoided conflict. They stayed sensible while the United States acted aggressively. They offered cooperation while America delivered warnings. And now others are observing. They're seeing Canada successfully branch out from the United States. They're seeing U.S. pressure fail. They're seeing China emerge as a dependable, fair trade partner. The effects reach well past Canada and beyond trade in EVs and canola. Something more fundamental is unfolding that often gets overlooked amid the numbers and tariff rates. This concerns sovereignty. This is Canada claiming its authority to handle its own economic choices without needing Washington's approval. For too long, people assumed Canada had to run major policies past the United States, that Canadian governments should prioritize American concerns over Canadian ones. That's not true partnership, that's dependency. What Carney is achieving is declaring that Canada is an independent nation that bases decisions on Canadian needs, period. If that matches American needs, fine. If not, that's what independence looks like. And you can sense how unsettling this is to the U.S. establishment. Because if Canada manages to secure economic independence, what prevents Mexico? What stops other nations in Latin America, Europe, Asia? The whole structure of American economic control relies on others thinking they lack options. Canada is demonstrating options exist, and that's alarming to Washington. Let me focus on the electric vehicle part for a moment, because this highlights the forward-looking approach Canada is taking compared to the defensive reaction from America. The future of travel is electric. That's simply fact. And Chinese companies currently lead in affordable, high-quality EVs. Firms like BYD produce cars people want at prices they can handle. The U.S. strategy has involved erecting tariff barriers to guard traditional automakers that have been slow to change, costly, and producing vehicles that struggle worldwide. That protectionism may preserve certain jobs in places like Detroit temporarily, but over time it forces American buyers to pay extra for lesser products while the world advances. Canada's method differs. By lowering tariffs on Chinese EVs, they're declaring they want citizens to enjoy top vehicles at fair prices. They want to speed up the move to electric transport. They're refusing to sacrifice environmental aims and consumer benefits to defend an American auto sector that won't evolve. And this will succeed. Canadian buyers will gain affordable EVs. Canada will hit emissions goals sooner. The Canadian auto market will grow more competitive, pushing every maker, including American ones, to enhance offerings to stay relevant. Meanwhile, American buyers will continue facing higher costs for vehicles that lag globally. That's not Canada's issue. That's America's issue, created by its own policies. The agriculture side of this pact needs more focus, because that's where everyday Canadians see clear, immediate gains. Canadian beef producers regained entry to the Chinese market after years of exclusion. That's significant. China represents a huge beef market, and Canadian ranchers create some of the finest beef anywhere. Exclusion since 2021 caused real damage to family operations, to processing plants, to whole regions tied to cattle. Now that door is open again, thanks to a deal negotiated for Canadian benefit. The same applies to canola growers, lobster harvesters, pea producers. These are ordinary Canadians earning livelihoods who now enjoy better entry to an enormous market. Lower tariffs make their goods more competitive in China. That drives more sales, more employment, more stability for farming areas that have struggled. And what's been the American answer? Warnings. Pure warnings. No alternative markets suggested, no offers to help Canadian farmers reach other places, just threats that would worsen things for Canadian agriculture through tariffs. So when faced with American warnings versus Chinese opportunities, Canadian farmers will pick opportunities every time, and they'd be unwise not to. Let's look ahead a little because this pact's effects stretch well past 2026. Prime Minister Carney's team has aimed to greatly boost exports beyond the U.S. by 2035. That's under 10 years from now. This China arrangement marks the initial big move in that plan, but more will follow. Canada will seek trade pacts with India, the European Union, Southeast Asian countries, Latin American nations. The approach is straightforward. Develop a varied set of trade links so no single nation can apply the pressure the United States has long used. As Canada advances in this diversification, the balance between Canada and the United States shifts fundamentally. American warnings lose force. Canada gains its own influence. The relationship must become more balanced because Canada has alternatives. This will alter North American politics. It will compel U.S. leaders to treat Canada as a true partner rather than a dependent, because otherwise they'll grow more isolated as Canada strengthens ties elsewhere. We must address Donald Trump's part in this, because his 100% tariff warning actually sparked the political opening for Carney to act. Trump thought he appeared tough. He believed he was safeguarding American goals. Instead, he drove Canada further away. He built the strongest argument for Canadian diversification that any Canadian leader could hope for. Each time Trump warns Canada, each time he disparages Canadian officials, each time he treats Canada as lesser instead of equal, he simplifies Carney's task of convincing Canadians this trade shift is necessary. He turns what might be divisive into obvious common sense. And the misfortune for American goals is that Trump and similar figures don't seem to get it. They assume because the United States is bigger and stronger, they can intimidate neighbors into line. They miss that in today's global economy, nations have choices. They miss that warnings frequently backfire. This China pact owes as much to Donald Trump as to Mark Carney. Trump made it essential. Trump made it feasible politically. Trump made it pressing. And now Trump and American companies must face the results of that error. There's a larger takeaway about economic pressure and its decline in the 21st century. For decades, the United States has relied on economic tools as key foreign policy instruments: sanctions, tariffs, threats to cut market access. For a period, it succeeded because U.S. economic power was so overwhelming that alternatives seemed unrealistic. But the world economy has evolved. China has emerged as another economic center. Regional trade groups have grown. Nations have spread their partnerships. And American economic warnings increasingly lack their former impact. Canada's bold move toward China, despite U.S. warnings, serves as a prime example of this shift. It shows middle powers can resist American economic pressure by building options. And other nations are paying attention. They're drawing lessons from Canada. They're recognizing that American warnings can be endured, that choices exist, that economic independence is possible even for countries long tied to America's sphere. This carries deep consequences for future U.S. foreign policy. The methods effective for decades are losing power, and American leaders will need to adjust or lose their ability to influence global economic patterns as before. Let me return to why this hits home so strongly for ordinary Canadians. Because amid discussions of trade rules and global ties, we sometimes overlook the personal side. Canadians are weary of being seen as lesser neighbors. They're fed up with American politicians casually endangering their economy. They're tired of expectations that Canadian priorities come after American ones. This China pact, along with the wider diversification effort it launches, is about dignity. It's about Canada insisting on equal treatment. It's about Canadian leaders finally declaring, "We'll decide based on what's right for Canadians, not what pleases Washington." And that message connects deeply. It connects with Canadian farmers seeking global markets. It connects with Canadian workers wanting economic control for their nation. It connects with Canadian shoppers wanting affordable goods, including EVs. It connects with Canadian people proud of their country and done with being bullied. Mark Carney gets this. He knows standing firm against American pressure isn't merely smart policy, it's smart politics. Canadians want a leader who protects Canadian interests, even against the United States. And that's precisely his approach. There's also an environmental angle worth noting, tied to the EV portion of the deal. Canada holds strong climate targets. Achieving them demands a fast switch to electric vehicles. But if EVs stay too costly for average Canadians, that switch slows. By permitting Chinese EVs at lower tariffs, Carney's government is hastening that change. They're ensuring electric vehicles reach regular Canadian households, not only affluent early buyers. That cuts emissions. That aids Canada in fulfilling Paris Agreement promises. That establishes Canada as a climate frontrunner. Meanwhile, the United States, with protectionist tariffs inflating Chinese EV costs, delays its own electric transition. American buyers face steeper prices, adoption lags, emissions goals grow tougher. This is yet another case where American policy harms even American aims. If addressing climate change is the objective, you accelerate EV use by making them affordable. Protectionist tariffs that raise prices oppose that aim. Canada is taking the practical route, the one that truly supports its climate objectives instead of shielding old industries at environmental cost. So, what's next? We're seeing this develop live, and upcoming decisions matter greatly. The choice rests with America. Will Trump carry out his 100% tariff warning? If he does, he'll spark a trade conflict that damages American companies and buyers far worse than Canada. Canadian sales to the U.S. would face huge tariffs, sure, but American purchases from Canada would vanish, creating supply chaos, price spikes, shortages. More probably, we'll hear plenty of tough talk from Washington, but acknowledgement that full tariffs would be economic self-harm. So expect warnings, sharp remarks, perhaps limited countermeasures, but not the complete 100% barrier promised. For Canada, the path is obvious. Keep expanding trade links. Keep forging partnerships with China, Europe, Asia, Latin America. Keep lessening reliance on the American market until U.S. warnings matter less and less. The coming months will be captivating because we're witnessing a core change in North American economic ties unfold live. And Canada, not the United States, holds the steering wheel. There's a trust factor worth considering. When the United States issues warnings and then either backs off or enacts them in ways that hurt itself worse, it erodes trust. Trump warned of 100% tariffs if Canada pursued this China pact. Canada pursued it. If Trump doesn't act, the warning looks hollow and future ones weaken. If he acts, he inflicts U.S. economic pain that makes the warning seem misguided. Either outcome damages American trustworthiness, and that counts because global relations rely on credibility. If warnings aren't taken seriously, a key influence tool vanishes. Canada, conversely, is gaining trust. They promised trade diversification. They're delivering. They promised not to bow to American warnings. They're showing it. Other nations notice, and Canada's standing as an autonomous global player rises. This isn't merely one pact. This is about image, perception, reliability versus unpredictability, and currently Canada is prevailing. Some will question if this harms the wider U.S.-Canada alliance, if trade friction affects security ties or other areas. That's a fair concern. But alliances thrive between equals. When one side views the other as lesser, when one expects obedience, that's not healthy. That's dominance. What Canada is doing is demanding equality, which may spark brief tension, but ultimately strengthens the alliance through respect rather than coercion. The United States must realize it can't demand subordination economically while expecting alliance loyalty elsewhere. If America wants a solid partnership with Canada, it must treat Canada as equal in every field. This pact is Canada's way of delivering that message. Whether Washington listens and changes course is still unclear. Let me tie this together because what we're seeing is truly historic. Canada has shown a middle power can successfully stand up to American economic pressure by creating alternatives. Prime Minister Mark Carney faced Donald Trump's 100% tariff warning and responded, "We're proceeding anyway." And he did. The China Pact is complete. Canadian farmers and companies already enjoy better Chinese market access. Canadian shoppers will soon access affordable Chinese EVs. Canada's trade diversification effort is active and delivering results. Meanwhile, American warnings proved ineffective. The pressure effort failed. Rather than stopping the China Pact, the warnings hastened it, validated it, made it politically vital for Carney to demonstrate Canada wouldn't yield. This marks a turning point in North American ties. The economic pattern shaping this continent for generations is changing. Canada is claiming independence. America is losing its dictate power. And the world is observing and absorbing the lesson. For Canadians, this should spark pride. Your government defended your interests. Your prime minister refused to surrender to threats. Your nation is following an independent direction guided by Canadian needs, not American orders. For Americans, especially those backing the aggressive warning style Trump represents, this should serve as an alert. That style no longer succeeds. It's rebounding. It's alienating allies and bolstering rivals. A fresh approach rooted in partnership instead of control is urgently required. But whether or not Washington absorbs that lesson, Canada is advancing. The China Pact is sealed, the diversification plan is rolling, and the period of Canadian economic dependence on the United States is ending. That's the event. That's its significance. And that's why it far exceeds a routine trade pact. This is Canada declaring it's done. This is Canada selecting its future. And this is Canada succeeding.